Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Forget the glamorous image of spies you've seen in movies, slipping through shadows, seducing kings and sneaking away with top-secret scrolls. The reality: ancient empires weren't exactly kind to women who got caught in the espionage business. Spoiler, it usually wasn't pleasant, so before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this slow drift into the weirder corners of history. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how many of you are tuning in from different corners of the world, whether it's the middle of the night or you're just pretending you're about to study. Alright. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, pull up a blanket, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, what really happened to female spies once they were caught in the ancient world? Let's be clear up front. These were not James Bond stories with cocktails and witty one-liners. These were messy, human, and often tragic. Empires like Persia, Rome, and China had entire systems of intelligence, long before anyone thought about trench coats and sunglasses. But female spies were walking a thinner tightrope than most. Their work depended not only on secrecy, but on the deeply suspicious attitudes toward women operating outside their proper roles. Take the Persian Empire. The Persians were masters of intrigue, couriers, coded messages, networks stretching across their massive territory. And while women could be involved in passing information, if you were caught, let's just say the ancient Persians were not sending you off with a polite, "better luck next time." Punishments ranged from imprisonment to execution, often designed to make an example of you. After all, in an empire built on loyalty to the great king, betrayal, especially by someone overlooked or underestimated, was a double insult. Rome wasn't much better. Roman writers loved to gossip about women using charm to gather secrets. And of course, if you were caught. The official story was always scandal, shame, and exile. Romans had this way of folding espionage into morality tales. See what happens when women step out of line. Convenient, right? You get rid of an enemy and reinforce the patriarchy in one go. Meanwhile, in China, imperial courts were labyrinths of suspicion. Palace women, attendants, even concubines. Any of them could be accused of passing information to rival factions. If caught, the punishment could be brutal. Think isolation, forced labour, or a quiet disappearance from the records. But here's the twist. Sometimes these same women were never officially acknowledged as spies at all. They were simply erased, which in its own way was almost worse. And yet the risk didn't stop women from spying. They were often in the perfect position to overhear conversations, slip through guarded spaces, or pass messages no one suspected. That's the irony of it all. The very reason women were underestimated made them effective spies. But the same thing that made them useful also made their punishments extra harsh when things went wrong. Let's drift a little deeper into this, because the stories of these women tell us not just about espionage, but about how ancient societies thought about loyalty, gender, and power. So, let's float gently into Rome again, because Rome is where espionage got deliciously messy. Romans loved scandal almost as much as they loved aqueducts, and the idea of a woman, especially a noble woman, trading secrets was irresistible gossip fuel. Take Julia, the daughter of Augustus. Officially, she was caught up in an adultery scandal, but buried under all that moral posturing was another layer. Her lovers weren't just any men. They were politically connected, and that meant pillow talk could easily become espionage. Whether Julia was genuinely passing secrets or just enjoying her social life, the punishment was the same: exile. Augustus, her own father, shipped her off to a barren island with no men allowed. Well, except the guards, but they were sworn not to touch her. Talk about awkward dinner parties. And then there's Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. Messalina has been painted by Roman historians as basically the scandal queen of the empire. Was she an actual spy? Not exactly, but she did use her influence in ways that felt suspiciously like intelligence gathering. Secret meetings, backroom deals, alliances formed over late-night conversations. And when she finally got caught plotting, Claudius had her executed without even granting her a face-to-face meeting. Which, honestly, says less about espionage and more about how little patience emperors had for wives who knew too much. Byzantium, the eastern continuation of Rome, took this to another level. Imagine endless corridors lined with silk, whispers behind veils, and eunuchs darting about with messages. Byzantine court life was basically a spy novel written in slow motion. Women here, empresses, princesses, and courtiers, were often accused of spying whether or not they actually were. Anna d'Alessandro, for example, was accused of manipulating alliances through secret letters and family ties. The punishments were rarely swift. Instead, they involved long stretches of confinement in convents, because nothing said stop plotting like being locked in with nuns for the rest of your life. Now, let's drift over to Persia again, but this time into the later Sasanian Empire. Here, female entertainers and courtesans were sometimes accused of being double agents, passing messages between noblemen, generals, and foreign envoys. If caught, the outcome wasn't just personal punishment. Entire families could be branded disloyal. A courtesan might be executed, but her brothers and sons could lose property or titles. The empire believed in collective punishment, because why ruin one life when you can ruin 10? But it wasn't always noble women or courtesans. Sometimes it was just the wrong servant in the wrong place. Imagine being a kitchen maid who gets handed a sealed scroll with the casual instruction, "Oh, just drop this off at the senator's house." She probably didn't even know what was inside. But if that scroll was intercepted and turned out to be treasonous, goodbye kitchen, hello execution block. Which brings us to one of history's darker ironies. Women were punished as spies even when they weren't intentionally spying. Sometimes just existing in proximity to secrets was enough to get you branded as dangerous. China again gives us some striking examples. During the Warring States period, spies were everywhere, male and female. Some women were sent deliberately to seduce enemy generals. If they succeeded, they might live comfortably for a time, but if discovered, their deaths were theatrical. Executions could involve public humiliation, stage confessions, even parading the accused through markets as a warning. And because ancient Chinese courts loved symbolism, punishments often mirrored the crime. A woman who whispered secrets might have her tongue cut out before being executed. Sleepy thought, I know, but at least we're not there. And here's the strange part. Despite all the horror, rulers couldn't resist using women as spies. They were effective, they were underestimated, and they could go places men simply couldn't. So, for every tale of a woman dragged through the streets as punishment, there were countless others who probably got away with it. History, of course, only wrote down the disasters. Success, especially secret success, doesn't make good bedtime stories. But as we drift further, let's pause on this image. Flickering oil lamps, a silent palace at midnight, and a woman quietly carrying a folded tablet or whispered word from chamber to chamber. She knows if she's caught, it's over, but she also knows that power, real, dangerous power, rests in these secrets. And in the silence of those hallways, history feels less like marble statues and more like soft footsteps and a held breath. So, let's drift gently out of the marble halls of Rome and Byzantium and into the chilly stone castles of medieval Europe. Here, espionage was no less common, but it was often dressed up in the language of sin, heresy, or treason. And of course, women who crossed the wrong line ended up as perfect scapegoats. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor herself was far too powerful and clever to be easily accused of espionage, but her circle, not so lucky. During her conflicts with Henry II of England, whispers swirled that Eleanor's ladies-in-waiting carried coded letters to French allies. Were they really spies? Maybe. Or maybe they were just glorified couriers caught up in dynastic melodrama. Either way, discovery meant ruin. At best, the women were dismissed from court. At worst, they were locked away in convents, because medieval Europe loved to use nuns as human filing cabinets for inconvenient women. And then there's the case of Marguerite Porete. Not exactly a spy, but a woman whose writings and influence made clerics nervous enough to treat her like one. Her mirror of simple souls spread through Europe, and when the church decided her ideas were too subversive, she was burned at the stake in 1310. Not espionage in the classic sense, but it's a reminder. Medieval power structures didn't care much about distinctions. If you threatened authority, politically, spiritually, or socially, you could be treated like a traitor. We also find stories in the 100 Years' War. English chronicles sometimes mention French women accused of spying in occupied towns. The punishments were usually swift and public. Hanging was the go-to, but occasionally there were more symbolic shames. One chronicler describes women paraded through town with shaved heads before being expelled, because humiliation lasted longer than execution. Medieval justice, always striving for efficiency. And let's not forget Spain. The Reconquista, centuries of Christian and Muslim conflict, produced constant paranoia. Women who worked in border towns, taverns or markets could easily be branded as double agents. Imagine selling bread in a frontier village, only to be accused of passing information to the enemy, because you spoke both Arabic and Castilian. Punishment often meant exile, which in medieval terms might as well have been a death sentence. Being cut off from your community was as harsh as any gallows. Of course, monasteries and convents offered their own twisted versions of punishment. When noble women were accused of disloyalty, espionage, or just too much ambition, their families often shoved them behind convent walls. It was the neatest way to erase a problem. No blood, no scandal, just a quiet transfer of power and a lifetime of prayers behind stone walls. You weren't technically executed, but you were socially dead. And if you were unlucky, your letters were monitored, your visitors restricted, and your daily life reduced to chants and silence. A sort of living exile wrapped in the language of holiness. Across the Channel, England had its own spy scares. During the Wars of the Roses, noble families accused one another of everything under the sun, including spying. Women close to court, like Elizabeth Woodville's kin, were sometimes whispered about as secret informants. The truth didn't matter. Once your reputation was tainted, you might lose lands, titles, or worse. And unlike the battlefield, there was no honour in being accused of espionage. It was a stain that clung forever. But perhaps the most telling part is how ordinary these accusations were. Espionage wasn't just James Bond-level daring missions. It was rumours. It was gossip. It was writing the wrong letter, meeting the wrong person, or simply being in the wrong room at the wrong time. Women in particular had little defence. Even silence could be twisted into suspicion. So picture it. A medieval castle at dawn, a noblewoman clutching a sealed parchment, a servant watching nervously, and somewhere down the hall, a lord sharpening his suspicions. The walls were cold, the air smelled faintly of smoke, and every step echoed too loudly. In those moments, the line between loyal subject and condemned spy was thin as parchment, and just as fragile. So, let's leave the drafty medieval halls and float into the Renaissance, an age of painted ceilings, elaborate wigs, and courtly whispers. It was supposed to be the era of rebirth, but if you were a woman accused of spying, it mostly meant a fresh coat of paint on the same old punishments. Venice is a perfect example. This city was obsessed with espionage. They even had the famous Council of Ten, basically an elite committee that micromanaged every whisper, every letter, every raised eyebrow. Women, especially courtesans, were prime targets. Why? Because they had access. Courtesans dined with senators, flirted with ambassadors, and overheard pillow talk that could topple trade agreements. Now, Venice was subtle. If a woman was suspected of spying, she wasn't usually dragged into the square and executed. That was too messy for a city that liked appearances. Instead, she might just vanish. Packed off to a convent or quietly drowned in the lagoon with a neat stone tied to her ankles. Very eco-friendly, very Venetian. The archives even record payments to gondoliers for special deliveries, which is exactly as ominous as it sounds. France, meanwhile, turned espionage into high drama. Catherine de' Medici, queen and power broker, kept her own network of informants, many of them women. Ladies-in-waiting carried secrets tucked into embroidery, coded into jewellery, or whispered during dances. But what happened when one of these women was caught passing information to the wrong side? The official punishment was often imprisonment in a chateau, basically house arrest with bad wine and too many rats. The unofficial punishment being smeared as immoral, witchy or hysterical, because nothing discredits a spy like accusing her of sorcery. England, of course, couldn't resist getting theatrical. Elizabeth I herself relied on spies like Francis Walsingham, but women who operated outside her blessing were fair game. If you were caught spying for Mary, Queen of Scots, your fate was sealed. Some women were interrogated in the Tower, then quietly disappeared from the records. Others were humiliated in public trials. The Tudors had a flair for spectacle, and nothing said, "Don't mess with us," like parading a disgraced woman through London in chains. It wasn't subtle, but then again, neither were the roughs. And speaking of Mary, Queen of Scots, she's basically a case study in espionage gone wrong. While imprisoned in England, her letters were intercepted, her ciphers cracked, and her ladies closely monitored. The women who carried her secret notes often paid dearly. One, Jane Kennedy, narrowly escaped worse punishment, but lived under suspicion for years. Others weren't so lucky. Getting caught with one of Mary's letters was enough to brand you a traitor, and traitors rarely retired peacefully in Tudor England. The Renaissance also gave us subtler punishments. Exile became a favourite. A woman accused of spying might be banished from court, stripped of her jewels, and forced to live on some remote estate. To modern ears, that sounds almost restful, but in Renaissance terms, it was social death. No court, no influence, no gossip. Basically, the medieval version of being unfollowed by everyone important. And let's not forget Spain again. Under Philip II, paranoia ran high, especially with all those wars against England and the Netherlands. Women accused of espionage might find themselves interrogated by the Inquisition. It wasn't always about torture racks and dungeons. Sometimes it was endless questioning, designed to wear down the spirit. Days of silence, followed by a demand to repeat every detail of a conversation you had 2 years ago. Sleep deprivation, humiliation, and eventually, if you were unlucky, a formal sentence of confinement. So yes, the Renaissance gave us pretty paintings and clever sonnets. But if you were a woman caught in the wrong whispering circle, your life could unravel in slow motion. A convent, an exile, a quiet drowning, or just the crushing boredom of being erased from court life. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't cinematic, it was quiet, controlled, and suffocating. Because in the end, espionage wasn't really about secrets. It was about power. And women, especially in these courts, were always easier to punish than the men who actually spilled state secrets over too much wine. By the 17th and 18th centuries, espionage was becoming professionalised. States were building networks, paying informants, and filing reports in actual cabinets instead of just scribbling secrets on the back of tavern menus. But one thing hadn't changed. If you were a woman caught spying, the consequences were still, well, let's just say not great. Take France, for example. The Enlightenment is remembered for powdered wigs, elegant salons, and philosophers debating about liberty while being funded by monarchs who had no intention of giving it to anyone. Women were central to this world. Salon hostesses gathered thinkers, writers, and diplomats in their drawing rooms, which meant they were also accused regularly of trading state secrets between the petits fours and the philosophy. If a salonier was suspected of spying, the state usually went with the shame her, ruin her, exile her strategy. Forget torture chambers. This was about character assassination. Rumours of affairs, pamphlets mocking her morality, and the sudden drying up of invitations from court. It was all very elegant, very passive-aggressive, and completely effective. For a woman whose entire power came from reputation, being socially ruined was worse than being locked in a cell. Across the Channel in Britain, things were a bit more blunt. This was the era of endless wars with France and endless paranoia about Jacobite plots. Women who carried letters for rebels or whispered news to foreign agents could find themselves in the Tower of London, or more often quietly bribed to stop talking. British officials had a knack for retirement packages, where a woman accused of spying would suddenly have just enough money to disappear into the countryside. Not so much mercy as a calculated investment. It was cheaper than a public trial, and much tidier. Russia, though, really leaned into the drama. Under Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, espionage became a matter of court theatre. Women suspected of spying might be interrogated in grand chambers, with nobles looking on like it was some sort of grim performance. If convicted, the punishments range from forced exile to Siberia, which, let's be real, was basically an elaborate way of saying good luck freezing out there. Some women ended up forced into convents again because apparently every empire thought the best use of a spy was to have her endlessly pray in silence. And then we have the Ottomans. The imperial harem was a hotbed of gossip and espionage. Women there had extraordinary access to the Sultan, but also extraordinary risk. If accused of spying or treachery, they could be executed, usually by drowning in the Bosphorus. The sources are vague, but there are repeated references to silencing troublesome women this way. Again, efficient, quiet, and just watery enough to make you wonder why every empire seems so obsessed with drowning as a method of punishment. Meanwhile, the growing bureaucratic states of Europe were starting to prefer paperwork over blood. Women accused of espionage were often subjected to endless interrogations, signed confessions and dull legal trials. Instead of a dramatic execution, the punishment might be a very long prison sentence, the confiscation of property, or the stripping away of titles. Boring on the surface, but devastating for the women whose entire lives depended on social standing. What's striking in this era is the double standard. Male spies, if caught, could be treated like dangerous players in the great game, sometimes even swapped in diplomatic exchanges or remembered as tragic heroes. Women, though, they were painted as silly, immoral, or naive, accused of using their bodies rather than their brains. Never mind that many of them were smarter and more subtle than the men. The narrative was too useful to pass up. So, as Europe polished its chandeliers and powdered its wigs, the fate of the female spy was still precarious. If you were caught, you could expect exile, social ruin, or the cold, damp walls of a prison. The world was modernising, yes, but the playbook for punishing women remained depressingly medieval. Because even in the Age of Reason, the treatment of women accused of espionage rarely made much sense at all. By the late 18th century, revolutions were breaking out like a rash across Europe and the Americas, and whenever there's upheaval, you can bet that espionage is lurking nearby, scribbling notes in invisible ink and passing folded letters under tavern tables. Women, of course, were still right in the middle of it all, and if caught, well, let's just say this era added a bit more steel to the punishments, sometimes literally, in the shape of a guillotine blade. Take France during the Revolution. Paris was awash with paranoia. Everyone was spying on everyone else. Neighbours ratted out neighbours. Pamphleteers accused salon hostesses of treason. And being seen reading the wrong newspaper could suddenly land you in front of the revolutionary tribunal. For women accused of espionage, the outcomes were rarely merciful. Some were executed because apparently the guillotine was the new solution to everything from aristocracy to gossip. Others were imprisoned in endless limbo with no trial, just waiting in overcrowded, lice-ridden cells until someone remembered them, or didn't. One famous example was Charlotte Corday. Now, she wasn't exactly a spy, more of an assassin, but her story shows how revolutionary justice handled women who meddled in politics. She stabbed Marais in his bathtub and was promptly guillotined. Female spies fared little better. Accusations of counter-revolutionary activities often got them the same fast track to the blade. In other words, in revolutionary France, women didn't get branded traitors for life. They got decapitated. Efficient, if not exactly subtle. Over in America, the revolution had its share of female spies. Some carried coded messages sewn into petticoats, others ran entire intelligence networks out of their kitchens. If caught, the British usually didn't execute them. It was bad optics to kill women outright. Instead, they'd throw them into makeshift jails, confiscate their property, or place them under house arrest. Basically, a slow burn of punishment rather than the quick chop. Still devastating though, especially since women's economic survival was already precarious. Napoleonic Europe had its own brand of spy paranoia. Napoleon adored surveillance. His police state was practically a prototype for modern intelligence agencies. Women suspected of passing secrets to the British, or even just gossiping in the wrong salon, were hauled in for questioning. Punishments ranged from exile to house arrest, with the occasional harsher penalty if the case was too public. The key was always discretion. Punish them enough to silence them, but avoid turning them into martyrs. And then, of course, there were the guillotine's encore performances. Revolutionary fervour lingered, and executions remained a handy way of resolving inconvenient spies. But the era also gave us a shift in tactics, shaming, surveillance, and endless paperwork. Female spies were often painted as dangerous seductresses, their bodies once again blamed for the state's anxieties. Governments leaned heavily into the trope of the femme fatale, because apparently it was easier than admitting women were just politically active and smart. So, in the age of revolutions, female spies faced everything from guillotines to exile to the humiliating grind of house arrest. The theme remained the same. If you were caught, your life was over, just in slightly different flavours, depending on which empire nabbed you. Let's float gently onward to the 19th century, where things get even more theatrical. Think secret codes, glamorous disguises, and governments that still had no idea what to do with clever women who got caught playing the spy game. By the 19th century, espionage had gone mainstream. Every empire had its little networks of informants, double agents, and the occasional desk clerk with a very suspicious interest in maps. And of course, women were there too, still underestimated, still useful, and still very much at risk if caught. Victorian England, for instance, had an obsession with propriety and manners, which made women the perfect spies. Nobody suspected the lady at the ball quietly twirling her fan. Surely she was only gossiping about who wore last season's gown, not passing coded signals to a Prussian officer across the room. But if she was caught, the punishments got weirdly inconsistent. Sometimes it was social ruin, ostracism from polite society, which in Victorian terms was basically a death sentence with better wallpaper. Other times, women were imprisoned, though the sentences were often lighter than men's. The logic went, women were too fragile for serious punishment, right after accusing them of toppling governments with a smile. Meanwhile, in continental Europe, female spies often found themselves labelled as courtesans or dangerous women of leisure. It was easier for governments to smear them as promiscuous than to admit they were politically sharp. If caught, many were confined to convents or locked away in remote estates. Picture a bored countess staring out at sheep for the rest of her life, all because she passed one too many letters with invisible ink. The American Civil War also produced its fair share of female spies. Belle Boyd, Rose O'Neill Greenhow, names whispered in half scandal, half admiration. They smuggled information in jewellery, coded messages in curls of hair, and entire military secrets in needlework baskets. When they were caught, punishments ranged from house arrest to actual prison. Rose Greenhow, for example, ended up jailed with her daughter in the old Capitol prison in Washington. Still, the Union hesitated to execute them. Public opinion wouldn't stomach hanging women, no matter how treasonous. So, they sat in cells, waited, and sometimes got deported. Then came the growing obsession with the femme fatale. The idea that women were naturally manipulative, dangerous, and somehow hypnotic became a neat way to explain why they were so effective at espionage. It wasn't intelligence or courage. No, it was their female wiles. A comforting story for governments that still didn't want to admit women were competent. But that stereotype had consequences. Female spies accused of seduction faced harsher sentences because they were seen as corrupting men, as well as betraying states. Double the scandal, double the punishment. Punishments in this era leaned toward exile, confinement, or public humiliation rather than execution. Governments liked the idea of controlling women quietly, without drawing too much attention. But make no mistake, the ruin was often complete. Once labelled a spy, a woman could lose her wealth, her reputation, her children, and any chance at a stable life. In the Victorian playbook, being socially dead was almost as final as the guillotine, just slower, duller, and with more embroidery. So, by the 19th century, female spies caught in the game were still paying steep prices, only now the punishments wore lace cuffs and smelled faintly of rosewater. Let's drift onward, nice and slow, into the 20th century, where things get louder, bloodier, and bureaucrats finally start filing paperwork on female espionage assets. By the time World War I arrived, espionage had become industrialised. Telegrams, codes, double agents. Every empire had its little networks, and women were suddenly front and centre. Not because governments had fully embraced equality, of course, but because women could move in ways men couldn't. Nobody questioned the maid dusting a cabinet. Nobody checked the governess's knitting bag, and nobody suspected the chic woman at a Paris cafe might be memorising troop movements between sips of absinthe. The most famous name here is probably Mata Hari, exotic dancer, mistress to half of Europe's military brass, and supposedly a master spy. In reality, her espionage was more about entertaining wealthy officers and occasionally passing scraps of gossip. But during World War I, France needed a scapegoat for its failures, and Mata Hari was perfect. She was foreign, she was flamboyant, she was already infamous. So when she was accused of spying for Germany, her trial was more theatre than justice. She was executed by firing squad in 1917. The real tragedy? Historians now believe her intelligence value was almost non-existent. She was killed more for her image than her actions. Other women fared differently. Some were imprisoned, quietly, discreetly, without the drama. Others were deported or locked in camps. World War I governments were reluctant to execute women, but they had no problem letting them rot behind barbed wire. It was punishment without the headlines. Then came World War II, which blew espionage wide open. Women served everywhere. Code breakers at Bletchley Park, couriers in occupied France, radio operators dropping into enemy territory at night. And when they were caught, the stakes were higher than ever. Nazi Germany didn't hesitate. Female spies were tortured, imprisoned, and executed just like their male counterparts. The Gestapo had no chivalry clause. Take Violette Szabo, a British agent parachuted into France. Captured during a mission, she endured interrogation and torture before being executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Or Noor Inayat Khan, another British agent of Indian descent, who operated a radio under constant threat of detection. She too was captured, tortured, and ultimately executed. Both are remembered as heroes now, but at the time, their deaths were just more quiet notes in the vast ledger of war. In the Soviet Union, female spies and partisans were everywhere. Snipers, couriers, infiltrators. If caught, German forces often subjected them to brutal reprisals. But the Soviets also punished their own. Suspected double agents, men or women, might be shot without trial by the NKVD. In a system built on paranoia, even loyalty was dangerous. The punishment of female spies in the 20th century was no longer about social ruin or convent walls. It was physical, direct and often final. Courts-martial, firing squads, prison camps. The modern state had no time for theatrics or fanfares. It dealt in cold efficiency. Women had finally achieved equality in espionage, if you could call dying in the same way as men did equality. And yet, many of these women were erased or minimised after the wars, their bravery folded into footnotes. Official histories praised generals and politicians, while the women who smuggled secrets under their skirts or tapped out coded messages in barns were quietly filed away. Sometimes, the silence after the war was its own kind of punishment, erasure. So, as the 20th century marched on, the fate of caught female spies had become brutally simple. No salons, no whispered scandals, no genteel exile, just bullets, prisons, and the occasional statue decades later. Let's drift into one last reflection. What all of this really means, and why bedtime history insists on circling back to the same tired theme. Power, control, and the endless human talent for making life harder than it needs to be. So, here we are, at the quiet end of this long story. After centuries of whispered secrets, convent walls, exile, prisons and firing squads, what really remained for the women who had risked everything in the name of espionage? Strangely enough, not much recognition. For most of history, when women spied, their stories were absorbed into the narratives of men. If a queen's maid leaked information, it was the Duke who got the credit for cleverly uncovering the plot. If a World War II agent transmitted vital signals from a damp French attic, her courage was described as support work in the official files. The erasure was quiet but relentless. The legacy of punishment was also persistent. For women, getting caught wasn't just about losing your life or freedom. It meant your reputation dissolved, your name turned into a rumour, your body remembered more as a cautionary tale than as a human being. A male spy might be honoured for his bravery, even if executed. A female spy was often remembered for her supposed seduction, her emotional weakness, or her scandalous behaviour. Even in death, her story was rewritten. Think about Mata Hari again. 100 years later, most people know her name, but not because of her real espionage record, which was flimsy at best. They know her as the seductive dancer, the femme fatale, the archetype. Her life became a story men told about dangerous women, not about power, politics, or the ugly realities of war. In other words, she became legend, but not on her own terms. In the Cold War, female spies still appeared, sometimes recruited by the KGB, sometimes working for the CIA, sometimes caught in glamorous scandals that the press devoured. But the theme remained. Women who spied were seen as aberrations, curiosities, or temptresses. Their skills mattered less than the image projected onto them, and when they were exposed, the punishment was still shaped by gendered assumptions. Male traitors were called traitors. Female ones were mistresses as seductresses or fallen women. And so the legacy lingers, not in statues or epic tales, but in the gaps of the archive, in the fragments of letters, in coded transmissions, in the few memoirs that slipped through censorship. Many of these women faded from collective memory not because they failed, but because history wasn't all that interested in remembering them as full human beings. Yet bedtime history has a way of rescuing fragments, because lying here in the soft glow of the present, we can glance back and recognise the pattern. Women spied because they had to, or because they chose to. They risked everything, often knowing the punishment would be harsher for them than for men, and still they did it, over and over, across empires, across wars, across centuries. So, the next time you hear about espionage, about James Bond, or about some dramatic Cold War mole, you can let your mind wander to the quieter, erased stories, to the women who stitched secrets into hems, whispered codes in convent corridors, or tapped Morse messages into the night air with frozen fingers. Most were forgotten, some were executed, a few became legends, but all of them left echoes, and that, I think, is a strangely fitting bedtime thought. That history is never as neat as the textbooks. It's patchy, biased, and often unfair. But if you listen carefully, past the noise of generals and kings, you can hear the softer, hidden voices, women's voices still murmuring from the shadows of the past. So, let's let their stories drift off now. Let's dim the lights, exhale, and leave the spies, caught or not, where they belong, in the long, winding dreamscape of history. Good night. Their skills mattered less than the image projected onto them, and when they were exposed, the punishment was still shaped by gendered assumptions. Male traitors were called traitors. Female ones were mistresses, seductresses, or fallen women. And so the legacy lingers, not in statues or epic tales, but in the gaps of the archive, in the fragments of letters, in coded transmissions, in the few memoirs that slipped through censorship. Many of these women faded from collective memory not because they failed, but because history wasn't all that interested in remembering them as full human beings. Yet bedtime history has a way of rescuing fragments, because lying here in the soft glow of the present, we can glance back and recognise the pattern. Women spied because they had to, or because they chose to. They risked everything, often knowing the punishment would be harsher for them than for men, and still they did it, over and over, across empires, across wars, across centuries. So, the next time you hear about espionage, about James Bond, or about some dramatic Cold War mole, you can let your mind wander to the quieter, erased stories, to the women who stitched secrets into hems, whispered codes in convent corridors, or tapped Morse messages into the night air with frozen fingers. Most were forgotten, some were executed, a few became legends, but all of them left echoes, and that, I think, is a strangely fitting bedtime thought. That history is never as neat as the textbooks. It's patchy, biased, and often unfair. But if you listen carefully, past the noise of generals and kings, you can hear the softer, hidden voices, women's voices still murmuring from the shadows of the past. So, let's let their skills mattered less than the image projected onto them, and when they were exposed, the punishment was still shaped by gendered assumptions. Male traitors were called traitors. Female ones were mistresses, seductresses, or fallen women. And so the legacy lingers, not in statues or epic tales, but in the gaps of the archive, in the fragments of letters, in coded transmissions, in the few memoirs that slipped through censorship. Many of these women faded from collective memory not because they failed, but because history wasn't all that interested in remembering them as full human beings. Yet bedtime history has a way of rescuing fragments, because lying here in the soft glow of the present, we can glance back and recognise the pattern. Women spied because they had to, or because they chose to. They risked everything, often knowing the punishment would be harsher for them than for men, and still they did it, over and over, across empires, across wars, across centuries. So, the next time you hear about espionage, about James Bond, or about some dramatic Cold War mole, you can let your mind wander to the quieter, erased stories, to the women who stitched secrets into hems, whispered codes in convent corridors, or tapped Morse messages into the night air with frozen fingers. Most were forgotten, some were executed, a few became legends, but all of them left echoes, and that, I think, is a strangely fitting bedtime thought. That history is never as neat as the textbooks. It's patchy, biased, and often unfair. But if you listen carefully, past the noise of generals and kings, you can hear the softer, hidden voices, women's voices still murmuring from the shadows of the past. Their skills mattered less than the image projected onto them, and when they were exposed, the punishment was still shaped by gendered assumptions. Male traitors were called traitors. Female ones were mistresses as seductresses or fallen women. And so the legacy lingers, not in statues or epic tales, but in the gaps of the archive, in the fragments of letters, in coded transmissions, in the few memoirs that slipped through censorship. Many of these women faded from collective memory not because they failed, but because history wasn't all that interested in remembering them as full human beings. Yet bedtime history has a way of rescuing fragments, because lying here in the soft glow of the present, we can glance back and recognise the pattern. Women spied because they had to, or because they chose to. They risked everything, often knowing the punishment would be harsher for them than for men, and still they did it, over and over, across empires, across wars, across centuries. So, the next time you hear about espionage, about James Bond, or about some dramatic Cold War mole, you can let your mind wander to the quieter, erased stories, to the women who stitched secrets into hems, whispered codes in convent corridors, or tapped Morse messages into the night air with frozen fingers. Most were forgotten, some were executed, a few became legends, but all of them left echoes, and that, I think, is a strangely fitting bedtime thought. That history is never as neat as the textbooks. It's patchy, biased, and often unfair. But if you listen carefully, past the noise of generals and kings, you can hear the softer, hidden voices, women's voices still murmuring from the shadows of the past. Their skills mattered less than the image projected onto them, and when they were exposed, the punishment was still shaped by gendered assumptions. Male traitors were called traitors. Female ones were mistresses as seductresses or fallen women. And so the legacy lingers, not in statues or epic tales, but in the gaps of the archive, in the fragments of letters, in coded transmissions, in the few memoirs that slipped through censorship. Many of these women faded from collective memory not because they failed, but because history wasn't all that interested in remembering them as full human beings. Yet bedtime history has a way of rescuing fragments, because lying here in the soft glow of the present, we can glance back and recognise the pattern. Women spied because they had to, or because they chose to. They risked everything, often knowing the punishment would be harsher for them than for men, and still they did it, over and over, across empires, across wars, across centuries. So, the next time you hear about espionage, about James Bond, or about some dramatic Cold War mole, you can let your mind wander to the quieter, erased stories, to the women who stitched secrets into hems, whispered codes in convent corridors, or tapped Morse messages into the night air with frozen fingers. Most were forgotten, some were executed, a few became legends, but all of them left echoes, and that, I think, is a strangely fitting bedtime thought. That history is never as neat as the textbooks. It's patchy, biased, and often unfair. But if you listen carefully, past the noise of generals and kings, you can hear the softer, hidden voices, women's voices still murmuring from the shadows of the past. So, next time you hear about espionage, about James Bond, or about some dramatic Cold War mole, you can let your mind wander to the quieter, erased stories, to the women who stitched secrets into hems, whispered codes in convent corridors, or tapped Morse messages into the night air with frozen fingers. Most were forgotten, some were executed, a few became legends, but all of them left echoes, and that, I think, is a strangely fitting bedtime thought. That history is never as neat as the textbooks. It's patchy, biased, and often unfair. But if you listen carefully, past the noise of generals and kings, you can hear the softer, hidden voices, women's voices still murmuring from the shadows of the past. So, let's let their stories drift off now. Let's dim the lights, exhale, and leave the spies, caught or not, where they belong, in the long, winding dreamscape of history. Good night.